Can you put your hand up if you did A-levels? Or, sorry, keep them up. So that's most people, right? It's the vast majority. So you might be surprised to learn that actually you are a minority in this country. By far more people do technical education when they finish their GCSEs. So that means BTECs, NVQs, diplomas, apprenticeships, a whole bunch of stuff. But it doesn't really look like this because technical education is a huge mess in this country. It kind of looks like this. So there are about 13,000 different technical qualifications. And the fallout from this is really bad. The fallout is that people don't get qualified well, they get off to the wrong start in life. As individuals, it turns into bad outcomes for them. As a nation, it's turning into bad outcomes for us. So, and DFE has been trying to fix this problem for quite a long time. And I'm working with some of the policy teams who are in various ways trying to fix this problem. So it's a wicked problem, like Andrea said. Are you guys familiar with this term? Yeah. So it's an academic conception, so it's got loads of really exciting bits of terminology like one-shot operations and what's the other one? No stopping rule. But I think fundamentally they are complex, interrelated, very often population level problems, the kind of thing that is in government's job description to fix. But the problem is that because of the complexity, there's no right or wrong answer. Solutions can only be kind of better or worse. There's another thing, I think, that's problematic in solving these, is that because it falls to institutions like governments to try and solve these unsolvable problems, one of the defining characteristics of the people who are trying to solve the problems is that they have no direct experience of the most common characteristics of them. So I asked you lot if you had done any technical education, and some of you said yes. So I was, a few weeks ago, I was in a room with 30 senior policy officials who are charged with designing the next generation of technical education, and none of them had done technical education. So it kind of like, it sometimes feels like this. So I think that these wicked problems are the sort of things that policy people are quite used to tackling, but UCD and UX people aren't. Certainly I wasn't. It was a bit of a shock to me when I arrived at education and started to look at these kind of problems. So what I wanted to share with you today, my learnings of tackling these kind of problems, and some of the approaches that we're taking to try and help policy teams kind of find a way through them. So one of the things that government tends to do when it's thinking about problems is think about them in very abstract ways. Unfortunately, it turns out so do service designers, or at least this one. So I'm going to tell you an embarrassing story. Right? When I started work on the 16 plus choices thing, I decided in an intensely foolish and hubristic way that what I was going to do was I was going to map the mind of a 16-year-old. All right? Because like, how hard can it be? I've been 16. I know 16-year-olds. You know? So I read all the social research, and I workshopped with like 50 or 60 experts within DFE, and I did what service designers do, which is do a diagram with a lot of circles in it. Right? So there's all kinds of amazing shit in here, you know, and I'm very proud of it. And so we then we go out and do some user research. So we go and talk to, I think it's about 130 kids in various schools. And I go out there with my awesome diagram in my back pocket, and it turns out to be no fucking use whatsoever, because if you talk to real people out there in the real world, here are 4 students, and they're all the same age. They're all doing the same qualification. They all probably live within about 10 miles of one another. I didn't ask, but I guess they're probably all third generation Afro-Caribbean. The department would probably think it can say quite a lot about this type of person, these kinds of students. What I can assure you is that they have nothing in common. These 4 people had literally nothing in common. They were doing different courses, they had different family backgrounds, they had different aspirations, where they'd come from was different, where they wanted to go to was different. And in talking to that first 130 people, literally no 2 people told us the same story. So when I say the map is not the terrain, thinking about things in abstract and trying to map them is, well, you've got to start somewhere, but it's like, this is the terrain. This is what is actually out there in the real world. Are there any policy colleagues in the audience? 1.5. Yeah. You 1.5 people. If you are working with teams and you've got the option to go and observe user research, go, but don't just go to one. Don't go to the one that's nearest to Westminster. Go to all of them, because what you find in these very complex problem spaces is that there's more difference than similarity for a lot of things. And I like this idea from Daniel Kahneman that it's not experiences that we remember and sort from, it's memories of experiences, right? So another thing that you've got to do is you've got to do this, right? So a couple of weeks ago, we went to an FE college, and I talked to a bunch of people on the level 2 plumbing course. And one of the questions we asked them was, what made you decide to do this thing? And one guy said, actually, I didn't decide to do this thing. I wanted to direct films, but my mum made me take a plumbing course. Right? So that really stuck with me, and I went back to the office and I thought about it. But then the other day I watched the video evidence, because we were videoing it, and nobody else said that. Nobody else said that. Everybody else said things like, I've heard the money's good. If I do this, I can work anywhere in the world. I could start my own business. It's a secure thing. People will always need plumbers, right? So the thing is that these really powerful personal stories are like kryptonite, all right? Because they skew that, especially when you're doing qual type research, they can really badly skew your perception of things. And a tool that, like a really simple tool that I've started using, is when we're going through and logging video evidence or just reflecting on what the team's impressions are, is to try and categorize those impressions, some, many, most. Yeah? So for instance, in education, there's a sort of a meme that kids do what their parents tell them to do. They choose the jobs, or they choose to go and do the qualification that their parents tell them to do. Well, some people do tell you that, all right? But actually many more people don't tell you that. What they say is that they're basically having to use the adults they know, like a cast of characters, to choose from. So if somebody tells you that they wanted to do one thing and their mum made them do another thing, they wanted to be a film director and their mum made them be a plumber, that sticks with you. But actually, most people don't say that. So if you targeted an intervention at parents, you would miss the mark. And the holy grail is if you can find something that almost everybody does. But my experience is that's super rare in these problem spaces. Because if that was the case, they would be fixable. Another thing that I've found it's really important to do is to look at the whole system. So again, that's the thing that I think UCD people are not very good at doing, but policy people are actually much more used to doing. And I think what I've learned at education is if at any point you think that you found the silver bullet in this problem space, what that means is you need to go and look again, okay? Because almost certainly there isn't one. The trick is to do this, right? It's to look for places where you can get, move the needle, but in lots of different places. Because in aggregate, those are the ways to get traction in these kinds of things. So here's an example of our initial sort of diagnosis of 16 plus choices problem space. So we tried to break it down into classes of things and then to evidence those. That allowed us to come up with a bunch of candidates for things to do next, and then the team could score them. And that's really best done in a multidisciplinary team where you've got UCD people, you've got policy people, you've got delivery people, right? Because they're between them, they can all make good judgments about those sorts of things. And then what we ended up with is a slate of things prioritised that we could begin to tackle. And I think that is the way to start to get traction in these complex spaces. Right now, there are about 750,000 16-year-olds, and in a few months' time, they're going to be doing their GCSEs. And in this country, the key to opportunity is to get 5 good GCSEs, including maths and English. Right, that's really important. So the reason being is that formula opens the door to A-levels, level 3, further education, apprenticeships, opportunity, generally speaking. Right? Of those 750,000 people, 200,000 are going to fail to hit that mark. Right? They're going to resit their GCSEs, and 80% of them are going to fail again. Right? As soon as that happens to you, statistically, all of the things that we all take for granted, things like, owning your own home one day, having a stable family life, doing a job you actually like, all that stuff starts to accelerate away from you at that point. Okay, so I can relate to this because this happened to me. Me and school didn't get on, and it took me 3 goes to get my maths GCSE, by which time I'd screwed up my A-levels, I lost my shot of going to college, and it actually took me 6 years to get up the confidence to get back into the education system. And when I did it, it was a lot easier to dig yourself out of this hole than it is now. But if you were to deploy all of the user research talent in this room on my 16, 17, 18-year-old self, I couldn't have told you why that was happening. And to this day, I can't tell you why that happened. All I can tell you is that it did happen. Okay? And sometimes that's as much as you can know. So Behavioural Insights team have taken this specific problem, and they've run an experiment, randomised controlled trial, using a nudge tactic. They haven't worried about why it's happening. They've just operated on the problem on the basis that it is happening. And what they have shown with this is that it is possible to move the needle on it, right? And when you're talking about 200,000 people this happening to, you move the needle by 10%. It's a lot of people. So this is exciting to me because it shows that that bit of the problem space is tractable. So I think that often what you've got to do is you've got to not focus on where the differences are, where the complex motivations are, not try and flatter yourself you're going to find the amazing insight. What you've got to do is you've got to focus on the stuff that almost everybody does. And you've probably got to not worry so much sometimes about why people are doing something or something's happening to them. What you've got to think about is what is happening to them and who's it happening to and where and when is it happening. So for instance, in year 11, so this is the year that you do GCSEs, we know that more than half of people who go into technical education don't choose what they're going to do until this point, quite often right at the 59th minute. I can't tell you about the motivations of 750,000 people, but what I can tell you is that in the autumn and spring term of year 11, they are all in timetable classes. I can tell you that as soon as they hit exam season, they basically leave school and they only really come back in for exams. I can tell you that when they then start their summer holidays, they essentially leave formal education and are totally unsupported right up until the point where they have to go into college and make a decision about potentially what they're going to do for the rest of their life. Right? So my instinct is, if we're going to stage an intervention here, it probably needs to be in the autumn or spring term of year 11, and it needs to be part of a timetabled classroom session. So operating on this kind of principle then, like how would we move forward? Well, first thing, we've got a map. Now we need to go and find out what the terrain's actually like. I mean, if at all possible, take policy colleagues with us to every encounter. We need to inoculate ourselves against those powerful personal stories that might skew our perception of things. We need to think about how this fits into the whole system. And if we can't understand why, if we can't understand those root causes, then maybe that's okay. We just have to work with what we do now. So finally then, some further reading. So if you want to know more about this idea of wicked problems, then the guy who kind of codified it is Horst Rittel. I really recommend reading this post by Kylie, who was, is she still here? She's
called Kylie.
Yeah, was a product manager, wasn't she, here at Justice? So this is the counter to the why you should inoculate yourself against some, because what she's saying in this article is that there are occasions where when some people say it, you actually need to prioritise for them and not everybody else. Jack and his team are doing awesome work here. I get over here every opportunity I can to see what they're doing, so keeping up with their blog is probably a must. And I really recommend reading this post by Paul Maltby. It's called What Digital and Policy Can Learn from One Another. And what's interesting about it is not what policy can learn from digital, it's what digital can learn from policy. So that's me, thank you.